Welcome to today's lecture with Emma Cocker. I will just introduce her with a few sentences. Emma Cocker is Associate Professor in Fine Arts at Nottingham Trent University, where she has been teaching for 15 years, which I find really amazing. And she has taught the whole growth of artistic interdisciplinary practice in fine arts, up to the doctoral level, which is her focus right now, supervising artistic research processes and PhDs. And she is co-leading the program Dream Doctoral Research Encounters in and Through Artistic Methodologies, together with her colleague Danica Maya. Before she joined Nottingham Trent University, amongst other positions, she also held the position as an education development manager at Side Gallery in Sheffield, where she also lives, and where she focused on the public program, including symposia and conferences. So the whole complex of transporting artistic practices in interactive processes to the people. I just want to mention 4 publications. For example, editorial process practices of phenomenological and artistic research, conversation as material, practices of phenomenological and artistic research, well, that doubles, in fact, and the yes of the no. So you can see maybe already from the titles that there's a strong focus on the epistemological processes and on questioning research through practice, through process. And Emma's fields, just to wrap it up in 3 points, can be described as researches in performing thinking in action, on aesthetic practices of existence in a really broad sense, and expanded language-based practices. And that's also why we invited her to give a lecture in our framework today, because we did not focus too much on performative language-based and body-related artistic research in our program up to now. So here we go. Welcome, Emma, and we are really curious to hear what you brought for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for coming along and for the introduction also. So I'm going to approach it as the lecture form, and hopefully it can be shared with some of your other researchers and artists. So what I want to do is to really draw on some of my artistic research collaborations to explore different performative, process-oriented and embodied approaches to working with and through language. So in one sense, you could say it's a presentation about a specific approach to language-based artistic research. But more broadly, it's also about exploring different ways of working with language or even with writing within art and artistic research more broadly. Specifically, this question of how to write from the embodied site of practice, writing as an embodied practice. So there's a few questions I wanted to pose to think about at the start. Firstly, in terms of this notion of writing as practice. So what might it mean to write from the embodied site of practice, to write at the site of artistic making and thinking as a critical creative activity? Or how might this practice of writing, this working with language, be conceived as part of, rather than separate from, the doing of one's artistic research practice? Or even how might writing be conceived as an artistic research practice? You might even think about what questions, what issues, what dilemmas, what struggles, perhaps even what pleasures and possibilities emerge within the process of writing as an artistic researcher. And then within this, I'm also interested in how might we write or read or even talk, all language-based practices. How might we do these things differently as artists, as architects, as performers, as choreographers, or as poets? So then in parallel to that, there's something very much about the how of languaging, the how of writing. How can we become more alert and more attentive to how we do things with words? So focusing on this how of writing, this how of languaging, highlights the critical role of decision, of clarity, of intention, of taking responsibility, because there are so many different ways that you can write, whether that's analytically or conceptually or theoretically or performatively or poetically. What different modes of writing or of languaging might your research practice and inquiry call for? And at what moments in that process? Yeah, what is called? What kinds of practices might be required? And then in parallel to that, what kinds of different sorts of sense making are generated through different approaches to these language-based practices? And how might there be scope for testing experimental tactics? So, yeah, it was interesting to hear the introduction. It felt quite old, actually. I should remember to update my university pages. I suppose I would describe myself very much as a writer artist, that is a writer hyphen artist. This hyphen holding the two terms in proximity, but also keeping them apart, somewhere between a writer and an artist, somewhere between the textual and the visual, between what can be said and spoken and what needs to be shown. So my own work unfolds restlessly along this threshold between writing and art, involving experimental, performative, collaborative, embodied approaches to producing text parallel to and as art practice. So I'm going to sort of show examples along the way, not always talking about them, but sort of having them as traveling companions in a way. Really, my approach is comprised of a matrix of writing, reading, and conversation practices. So I'm interested in how we might write, read, and speak from within or through practice. Indeed, how can writing, reading, and speaking be conceived as poetic aesthetic practices, as part of artistic research, rather than only as tools of explication or communication or information? So I often work in collaboration with other artists on quite long-term durational projects where the studio, gallery, or another site-specific context is approached as a kind of live laboratory for shared exploration. So willfully open-ended, experimental and process-based in focus, such explorations often culminate in the generation of artistic bookworks or research publications alongside performance lectures and other kinds of performance events. And within my own work, I suppose I can identify three strands, which I just wanted to touch on to sort of situate what I'm interested in terms of language-based research. One, I think, is very much to do with this sense of language as a medium and with its own sense of materiality. So there's various bodies of work which engage with the very materiality of language, the page, the ink, the paper, the mattering of language. Parallel to that, there's also this interest, I think, again, with this kind of physicality or materiality of punctuation. And in parallel, also something around reading in particular, reading as an aesthetic act, reading is a very particular form of poetics. But I don't really want to dive into those practices so much today. I want to really sort of focus more on this notion of embodied writing, this writing from or with or at the site of practice, this writing as an artistic research practice. So within my work, on the one hand, there is a kind of writing within, a writing that attempts to explore new ways of languaging from or within practice. And I'm going to come back to that as a later theme later. The other dimension of my practice has got this dimension of writing with, and I want to focus on that to begin with. So at times I write with another's art practice, writing parallel or alongside. Through writing in dialogue with the work of others, of the performers, artists, choreographers over the last decade, I've evolved a practice of writing in proximity or through adjacency that I call contiguous writing, conceived as a mode of creative, critical prose that touches upon rather than being explicitly about. So contiguous writing is not a writing about, but rather a thinking with or a writing with, writing alongside or in touch with another's practice. So contiguous writing takes the form of quite a dense kind of creative prose that's often developed over a very long period of time. So whether this is through witnessing an unfolding project or spending time with an artist in their studio, or following the evolution of a body of emergent work, quite often the contiguous writings end up as artist publications, often published in collaboration with other artists. So I want to just give an example of that. So for many years, I worked as part of the collaborative project Open City, which is an investigation-led research project that attempts to draw attention to how behaviour in the public realm is organised and controlled and to what effect, while simultaneously exploring how these rules or habits or conventions of urban space might be negotiated differently through performance-based interventions. So I was originally invited to produce a piece of writing in response to Open City's work before I joined them as a collaborator. And this writing was to be serialized over a number of postcards and would be distributed in the public realm to contextualize some of the issues or concerns that was present in the practice. So 6 postcards were initially produced in relation to very specific performance practices, each of which consisted of a time-based instruction on one side. So a bit like the action you saw before, whilst walking, suddenly and without warning, stop still and remain like this for 5 minutes. And then on the other side of the card, there was this serialized text. So in this particular example, card 5, one instruction reads, "Close your eyes and allow your feet to read the streets as though they were braille, as though they were a musical score. Pay attention to its orchestral patterns and invisible tempo, to the repeated rhythms and staccato breaks, interludes, capricious ruptures, to the melody of where played out and manifest in heavy palimpsest and notations along the margins. Construct a way of speaking back as an echo or vibration drawn and performed through your body. Choreograph your reply as a silent eulogy to others who have walked along this way." So this is another card from that series. But what you might see in this was that within this body of writing, I became very interested in how invitations, instructions, even almost provisional scores might be used for choreographing temporary forms of community within the space-time of a participatory performance, how these kinds of cited writings might have the capacity to produce communities of readers or respondents who become temporarily and potentially even visibly bound by the terms of a given text. The reason I wanted to talk briefly about this or mention this work, it's quite historical work now for me, but it was quite an important turning point in my own practice, a turning point from writing about towards a more performative approach in writing that attempted to enact, evoke, or even invoke its subject matter rather than only contextualize or theorize or describe. So this interest in working with instructions or scores in particular is carried on through many projects, including this, which is a collaborative project called No Telos from 2019, which was very much about exploring this role of uncertainty, disorientation, not knowing, within creative practice and during uncertain times. And the book itself, it's a collaboration with other colleagues, comprises predominantly scores, actually. So it's used as or it can be used as a manual for others to engage with as a way of navigating city space. But the score form and the resulting artifacts, I think, have become very central to my practice, and I'll come back to that a little later. But the Yes of the No, which was mentioned, is a collection of prose writing, and it really gathers a lot of this contiguous writing together. And collectively, the Yes of the No advocates different models of daily life through which to practice the as is, if you like, the what is there, in the subjunctive key of what is, or even perhaps what might be. So the Yes of the No comprises, again, provocations, proposals, invitations, a creative prose approach to thinking about potential ways of operating, which might range from navigating the city or errant acts of reading, from preparing for the unexpected and learning how to not know, to singular acts of sedition and collective expressions of an emergent kind of we. So yeah, this sense of working with a creative prose form, they actually take the form of paragraphs, quite dense prose paragraphs. And yeah, if you're interested, I'm currently working on another one called How Do You Do, which should be published hopefully in September, which very much deals with artistic process, the relational, embodied, material dimensions of artistic process, and potentially the thinking and action happening therein. The key thing with both of these publications, though, for me, the Yes of the No and How Do You Do, the forthcoming book, is that the form is creative prose, and actually creative prose is really the form in my own practice that enables me to make leaps of ideas towards what's not yet known. It's the mode through which the movement of thought in motion often takes place within my practice. However, it's important, I think, to say that writing is a very porous and unstable structure, and it has the capacity to be revisited and amended, cut up and reworked. So texts, my own texts, are endlessly expanded and contracted. Often ideas that I might be developing within a creative prose form, it's quite possible I might expand as what might be described as more conventionally academic chapters. The creative prose operates as a sort of storage system, if you like, of ideas waiting for the opportunity of further elaboration. So a good example of that is the postcard work with Open City, and my collaborative work with Open City later evolved into a chapter called Communities of Stillness, which was published in this academic collection. So rushes of writing, edits, distillation, redaction, cut, grafting and expansion, this doing, undoing and redoing again and again. So I'm interested, how is this nature of thinking with language? How do these words come into existence, into page, onto screen? And how do these words bring thinking into existence? And how does this thinking bring words into existence? And how does this thinking with and through words unfold, and can it be practiced? And how might this fixity of all of the words on the page meet the embodied experience of that which is endlessly disappearing as soon as it is coming into being? The beginning of a text is rarely the beginning. The beginning is often arrived at and not departed from. One beginning is absorbed or displaced by another in writing's waves of endless starting over. Writing sentences work to smooth words towards organized flows and sequential rhythms that once written appear as though they have always been as such, yet the process of writing is often circuitous or discontinuous, not linear. The beginning of a text is rarely located in the first word, much as the ending is unlikely to be the last. The time that it takes to write the words is condensed into the space that they occupy once ordered into line. The process of writing pulls liquid thinking towards the brink of thought, where it is coaxed further still towards the shape of letters congealing across the page. in becoming concrete, the process of thinking loses some of its flow or fluidity, for there is always something surplus that fails to be translated, that resists materialization into definitive form. The wrestle of how the words got there will soon be forgotten. So, yeah, I'm interested in this wrestle of how the words got there, this pressure of thinking in the action of writing with and against the resistance of the page, this capacity for writing's endless reworking and reworking. So words can be cut up, reworked. Words and language are a physical material that can be brought into a poetic play. Here is an immanent language, a coming into language, to borrow Helen Sixou's term, at times agrammatical, fragmentary, and without syntax. So writing's capacity for being moved and shaped at a visual level as much as in terms of informational sense. So writing often involves this leap into the dark, a leap of thoughts towards the page. And in that sense, writing can be a practice of discovery, a speculative and exploratory act that supports the process of thinking itself, helping the writer to think beyond the existing limits of what they've already known. Writing then is an uncertain practice, necessarily performed with a degree of blindness, where new thinking emerges through receptivity to, even through, the experience of not knowing, in the absence of a clear or definitive plan. So one myth I find quite useful to dispel is this idea that writing is simply a means for externalizing an already existent thought, this notion of writing as writing up. For me, writing is a means of generating thinking, provoking thinking. So how can we attend to writing's emergence, where this process of writing is not always linear or logical? Yes, this emergent writing is fragile and easily missed. How can we attend to these fleeting events of fragmentary thought? How can we attend to the fragility of thinking as it emerges in and through practice? As feminist philosopher Helen Sixou says, all these scenes, all these events which happen only once, all the re-beginnings which are new beginnings, if you do not grab them in the instants they pass, these pulsations are lost forever. In the moment where in passing they brush by us, they whisper in our ears, knocking at the doors of our senses, at our ears, at our nostrils, they wake in us thoughts never yet formed. And she continues, so have on hand a notebook, a bit of paper, and capture the rapid traces of the instant, that the past which arrives at full speed will engulf in a few minutes. What has just happened will perish. So, yeah, in my own research process, I'm often searching for a vocabulary live to the situation that I'm working with, trying to write the not yet known, where content is not already known in advance, but rather emerges through the material and poetic process of working with language. Yet, how do we go beyond words, beyond what we already know, beyond what we have already written, in search of new vocabularies, and in doing so create the conditions for new thought? Theorist Erin Manning talks about a language that does not yet know what it means. It has not yet defined where it can go, a form of writing for thought on the cusp of articulation. And in some ways, this is what writing can be. Here, the act of writing is not one of fixing ideas into stable form or repeating what you have elsewhere heard or read or know, but rather a process of stepping off into a space that might seem still unknown or uncertain. The Sixou says, writing is the delicate, difficult, and dangerous means of succeeding in avowing the unavowable. Are we capable of it? Quite a challenge. So in my own research inquiry, the focus is on the live and lived dimension of artistic process and practice, and very much the challenge of finding linguistic means adequate to the task of speaking with, through, and from that embodied experience. It involves attending to and attempting to give tangibility to the often hidden or undisclosed experiential aspects of the practicing of practice, focusing on the contingent moments of incipient decision-making, the navigation of competing forces, of resistances and pressures, this activity of working with and through obstacles or of figuring something out. particularly in my own work with emphasis on collaboration. So counterintuitively, though, perhaps, the search for this very close, precise, exacting means of correspondence between experience and language might be poetic, might need to be poetic. Accordingly, poets and writers have often been my guides. Let me tell you, says writer Clarice Lispector, I'm trying to seize the fourth dimension of this instant now so fleeting that it's already gone, because it's already become a new instant now that's also already gone. And she continues, and if here I must use words, they must bear an almost merely bodily meaning. I'm struggling with the last vibration. I make a sentence of words made only from instants now. Read therefore my invention as pure vibration with no meaning beyond each whistling syllable. So Siksu is very interested in the work of Clarice Lispector, and she observes how Lispector's approach to writing teaches the lesson of calling, letting ourselves be called, the lessons of letting come or receiving. Siksu reflects that Lispector's practice gives us the lesson of slowness. Slowness, the slow time that we need to approach to let everything approach, all the time we must put in to reach the thing, the other, to attain it without hurrying it, to come close to it. We must save the approach that opens and leaves space for the other, to keep the space of waiting open. What is open is time, not to absorb the thing, the other, but to let the thing present itself. So towards a mode of language that's in fidelity to embodied experience, for Siksu, what is needed is a mode of writing for touching the mystery delicately with the tips of the words and trying not to crush it. So over the last 10 years, I've been developing a practice through a series of artistic collaborations called Conversation as Material, as a way of attempting to write without writing, or write in fidelity to this sense of embodied experience. Conversation as Material is a language-based artistic practice for attempting to speak from within the experience of artistic collaborative exploration. It is a linguistic practice attentive to the lived experience of embodied aesthetic co-creation. There is a definite attempt to get at something. The thing is definitely what we are trying to get at. It is that point there. Only that thing might change. We are pointing to this space here and how this relates to there. What is being said by how it is being pointed, these surpluses which keep coming off the page, that, and then this running alongside. This is a space which is generative, and I don't quite know what that is, but if I have a hope for it, it is that something not known or not previously known is somehow produced. Ultimately, it is a question of form and of an endeavour. To build in spaces that are speculative, you have to build in spaces that are more speculative. Something is being diagrammed, a gesture is drawn in advance of knowing what it enables. The active spaces of the work are the places where I'm not quite sure what is happening. It is ultimately speculative, which isn't to say not definite. There is expectancy, but only an idea of the shape. The finger presses on and as it could be in relation to. So this is a kind of reworked extract from a performance reading from a project called collaboration with Rachel Lois Clapham. And comprised a series of performance lectures which in different ways engaged with the endeavour of writing as a practice, the event of collaboration, the labour of making the work itself, where we were searching for a way of speaking with and from the experience of really wrestling with language in the struggle of articulation. So the content of these performance lectures was generated through a practice of conversation as material, or better, the incipient practice of conversation as material emerged as a way of generating content for the lectures. So within this practice of conversation as material, conversation isn't really for reflecting on practice, but is conceived as a generative practice in and of itself, site and material for the construction of immanent intersubjective modes of linguistic sense-making. So the process is a fourfold process. It involves a period of conversation where we would engage in a framed conversation, might have a subject defined in advance, or the focus of the inquiry might emerge through the conversation. And then that process of conversation is transcribed by listening carefully and slowly to the transcripts, paying special attention to the peripheral and incidental parts of dialogue, those parts of speech that might have gone unnoticed. And then beyond that, the distilled transcript of conversation is further edited into a way through a kind of active redacting and highlighting, and then re-engaged through various kinds of presentation, which in this particular case involved performance lecture, as a way of trying to activate or amplify the vocative potential of the text for really trying to communicate the felt sense of the pre-reflective living experience of the overall practice that's taken as its focus. So conversation as materialism evolved as a practice of collaborative writing that unfolds through the interplay of different voices turning about together. Within Read, the struggle of working with language as part of the experience of writing becomes mirrored or echoed in the circling and indirectness of the conversation itself. So to give a flavour, this is a transcript from the conversation. We say, the work circles, it tries to think through. It is the point where you're trying to work something out. There is a sense of purpose without really knowing what it is. There is a grasping or a groping towards language. This notion of groping for something that you never get towards, the closer you get closer, but you don't necessarily get any more. Having something to say, but not being sure what it is, this reaching out feels purposeful, but it doesn't quite know what it is going to get. The purpose is accidentally found. There is something that couldn't be anticipated. The purpose reveals itself in the work. There is a purposefulness that came from being completely aimless in the way that it started. So the words come and in their own time, and they often come slower than you want. So here, this sense of circling of language might be thought of as a way of leaving open a space for that which is beyond language. Or rather, it might be that through the capacity of conversation has the capacity to hold a space open through circling in its sense of indirectness, somehow creating conditions for moments of insight to be glimpsed. So this practice called conversation has been used in other projects. It was adopted within the collaboration, the Italic Eye, a research collaboration with Claire Thornton, which explores the event of surrendering to a repeated fall. In the studio, a body falls over and over, lens acts as witness, a practice that's repeated over years. In the intervals, conversation recorded, transcribed, distilled. So the text you can probably just about make out at the bottom there is distilled from conversational, the conversations that we had over many years. And central to the Italic Eye was an attempt really to develop a poetic form of linguistic expression that tries to embody rather than describe the lived experience that it seeks to articulate. We asked, what happens if talking and writing about practice is no longer an event of explication, but is instead performed in the same key of doing? So I'm going to show an extract from a video, and the textual component is as I say, it's a distillation of conversational transcript. And again, returning to the transcript, we talk a little bit about this process of trying to work with language. We say, there is a commitment to a certain kind of embodied investigative act and to a linguistic poetic investigation of language that together are spurs or tools or provocations for activating a kind of embodied thinking. it is difficult for us to write about, which is why we are producing the writing through speaking. There is something to do with producing the writing without having written it, knowing that it will come, it is coming from somewhere else in the body, or it is not coming in the same way as if you were trying to write. It is definitely coming from a different experience. It is coming from a felt experience of being, working with the body, feeling its kind of pathetic limitations and irritating blockages. The body makes phrases, language comes out in fits and starts, like gestures, like exploratory gestures, almost bypassing what the mind thinks. There is something in the form of language originating from speech, from conversation. There is an embodied rhythm to it, which is different to the rhythm of something that was purely written. I cannot produce this rhythm if I was to try and write it. So when you read it, the thing about reading is that you inhabit it, you re-inhabit it with a rhythm, and especially if you speak it out loud, you really inhabit the rhythm. So within this particular inquiry, an attempt was made to transform the perceived difficulty of putting into words from a problem into a provocation. We asked, how can we develop a poetic means of linguistic expression that embodies rather than describes? Yes, we recognize it can be difficult to shape things in words. Language sometimes feels too stiff and rigid. It also needs to be stretched and flexed. So we thought, how might language be exercised akin to lungs and limbs? So we were looking for a way of falling through conversation, this idea that language itself might be able to invoke or enact this notion of falling. Significantly, the pace of conversation within this collaboration had the feeling of rising and falling, of dipping and peaking, moments of excited acceleration, pauses, deliberation, omissions, syncopation, repetition, sentence incompletion. Yet at the same time, it allowed us to linger in and extend the phases of falling in a way that the photographic document didn't allow. Different practices have different temporalities, intensities, and duration. Conversation as material slows, or rather, it combines the quick, the immediacy, the aliveness of speech, of leaning into the unknown as a kind of linguistic fall, with a slowness made possible through returning to the transcripts for gradually intensifying and densifying a language through distillation. So our ambition was to strive towards a state of exhaustion and elasticity in word and thought, stepping off from the stability of our fixed subject positions towards a fluid process of co-production, intermingling of one another's word and thought, and intersubjective, even infrasubjective vocabulary emerges only after what one wanted to say has been exhausted or has been used up. So this kind of conversational sparring enables a form of thinking and articulation beyond what is often conceivable as on one's own. As Maurice Merleau-Ponty states in The Visible and the Invisible, a genuine conversation gives me access to thoughts that I did not know myself capable of, that I was not capable of. And sometimes I feel myself followed in a route unknown to myself, which my words, cast back by the other, are in the process of tracing out for me. So, within the Italic eye, conversation as material unfolds through a heightened sense of embodied awareness, a receptivity or willing rather than being willed, trusting in the process. We ask, how do you get beyond what you already know? How do you lean over the edge of the known? How is it to allow oneself to inhabit a space of wordlessness? And how does it feel to be lost for words? To speak then before knowing what it is, what one is going to say. Conversation as material is a practice of attempting to think through speaking, to allow vulnerability, to allow embarrassment, the experience of struggling with, stumbling and falling over one's words. So I'm just gonna pass through this a little bit. I'm realizing time is flying by, because I wanted to give a couple of other examples where this practice of conversation as material has been activated. Certainly within the project Choreographic Figures, we activated this as a wider attempt to explore those forms of thinking, feeling, knowing produced within collaborative exchange, particularly between the lines of choreography, drawing and writing. So we worked within this project with my collaborators Nicholas Ganstra and Mariella Greil within what we called method labs, studio space times where we would come together for the live exploration. And within this process, we recorded many of our conversations. In fact, over the 3-year project, we recorded over 150 hours of conversation, resulting in over 350,000 words of transcript. And these transcripts were revisited in various kinds of ways. On the one hand, it enabled us to write some of the conceptual chapters for the book that came from the project. Many of the words of these chapters originated in the conversation itself. We were also able to search through these transcripts. For example, here, there's a list of all of the sentences that began with how from the whole of our archive. And what it enabled us to do was to create this chronology of questions through a simple search of the transcript material, a kind of an evolution of all the hows for the project. But we also used the transcript very much as live and in an improvisatory way within the performances themselves. An attempt to liberate language. Within this inquiry, words became transformed through speech and voice, through the embodiment of text, this act of rolling language around in the mouth as a physical practice. So within choreographic figures, conversation as material became hybridized with the reading practice. And I want to kind of touch on, let me think time-wise, yeah, I think I'm okay for time. Just a couple more examples of practice where this conversation and reading practice have become hybridized. So the first example I want to touch upon is called Dorsal Practices, which is a collaboration with Katrina Brown, which explores the notion of a back-oriented awareness and attitude in relation to how we as moving bodies engage with self, others, and world. And we ask, how is our experience of listening, voicing, even thinking shaped differently through this tilt of attention and awareness to the back? So this dorsal orientation involves releasing or deprivileging the predominant social habits of uprightness and frontality, the head-oriented, sight-oriented, forward-facing, future-leaning tendencies of a culture intent on grasping the sense of the world through naming and control. We ask, how is this embodied experience of a dorsal orientation? And what new approaches emerge in the intermingling of movement-based ways of thinking, feeling, knowing, and language-based artistic research? Indeed, what forms of writing or languaging can be developed in fidelity to these embodied experiences of dorsality? So the project unfolds through a threefold inquiry. Since 2021, Katrina and I have been meeting online, partly because of the pandemic, but it's really opened up a new way of inquiry. So we've been engaging in a series of month-long investigations involving movement, lying down, axial rotation, backwards walking, activating the dorsal in different ways. And then we come together on Zoom, often undertaken back to back as a way of subverting the frontal habits of online engagement. We've become very interested in this act of listening and being listened to as a way of generating a kind of dorsal voicing. These texts are then transcribed and again highlighted and redacted. But here the significance is that we don't arrive at a text. We are trying to explore the production of a text through a reading practice. I'm going to just show a little clip from that.
Environments.
Backwards.
Water.
Letting.
Backbone, background, backtrack. Again, it is falling into binaries, but how these binaries create a field, a dynamic field.
Trying to activate or counteract an antidote to that next.
And the sense of not having gravity acting on the body.
Whereas backwards, there is a lot of acceptance, listening, allowing things in, a connection with the environment.
And all these variables within small sequences, within some senses. I have not really dwelt within these practices, more a kind of sampling.
Reconfiguring of how muscles and joints and things connect with each other. So what's happening in this practice is we have the transcripts of the conversation and we're reactivating them as an improvisatory reading practice. And we're sort of interested in this idea of producing a temporal, ephemeral, occasional kind of writing through this live active reading. And I've recently begun to do some performance lectures from this where we've come together in the same space. So actually this was one of the presentations that we gave at the recent SAR conference. Let me think what to do. I'm just going to show a very short clip from this and then briefly mention it because I realize my time is running out.
Please take your time, Emma. It's wonderful to listen to you, and we are not in a rush. So
is it okay?
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. It's great. Yeah.
Thank you. There is a coming alive in the moment that creates conditions for thinking, releasing and at the same time arising, a release into and something that is uprising.
A kind of momentum between a grounding experience, a settling experience, and then some of the practices had an agitating feeling in a sense, stirring in a sense, really even a bit excitable.
There is somehow a fluidity, the softness of the ground, this unevenness, this aliveness.
Then coming back to a stiller sense.
Gentleness. Something happened on the physical level of gentleness. It produced or constituted a gentleness of being there. So, yeah, the extract that I was just showing you is from a current collaboration called Thinking Aesthetic Thinking Through Aesthetic Research Practices, which is a collaboration between myself, Alex Arteaga, Nicole Vendel, and originally also with Sabina Sahn. And in this collaboration, conversation as material has also been activated. What we've been doing again over these last years is coming together online again through Zoom as a way of trying to explore the conditions for a certain kind of thinking, aesthetic thinking. So within this particular collaborative project, we ask, how do specific aesthetic research practices enable or enhance aesthetic thinking, and what kinds of practices can be developed? How does the coexistence, coinciding and mutual conditioning of different practices enable or enhance aesthetic thinking? And how can we bring practices into relation? And then what are the conditions of aesthetic thinking? And how might these conditions be nurtured? What supports or enables the emergence of the conditions for aesthetic thinking, and what inhibits or limits it? So from the point of view of conversations material, again, what we've been doing is having conversations which are recorded and transcribed, and then those transcripts get reactivated through a reading practice. So in the previous example, Nicole Vendel is engaging in a drawing practice, parallel, exactly synchronous to Alex and I engaging in a reading practice. And here you can see 4 concurrent practices taking place within the frame of Zoom. I'm actually working with the text at the moment, where I'm live listening to a previous conversation and transcribing it. So it's very much this kind of the ecological bringing together of different practices. So in actual fact, dorsal practices, well, all of these choreographic figures, dorsal practices, thinking aesthetic thinking through aesthetic research practices, all have research catalogue expositions. So if you're interested in them, please do have a look. What I wanted to do before I finish was just to kind of bring a sense of a slightly wider context to some of this, really. Because the quest to try and find ways of writing, ways of languaging in fidelity to the complexity of practice is a perennial problem for artistic research. However, within the field of artistic research and practice, there can often be some kind of skepticism or even doubt around the capacity of language for giving articulation to the non-reflective dimension of artistic experience. So Henk Borgdorf says, is it possible? Is it possible to achieve a linguistic conceptual articulation of the embedded, enacted and embodied content of artistic research? Indeed, you could even say what's at stake in trying to bring into speech or into language those artistic experiences that are often described as pre-reflective or non-propositional, even perhaps tacit or implicit. So yes, within the field of artistic practice and research, the relationship between art and writing can sometimes seem quite tense, even quite antagonistic, where writing is often perceived as a form of explanation or justification, all too keen to explain away all that is untranslatable or unsayable, the very embodied experiential dimension of artistic artifact and activity. So here it might be that language is conceived as a kind of ventriloquism that speaks on behalf of art. At times there may be perceived a tendency within the arts for understanding or even equating writing with the activity of explaining, rationalizing, positioning, arguing, where writing is considered as somehow synonymous with theory or with theorizing or conceptualizing or contextualizing or for reflecting on or about practice through the prism of existing theories and concepts. So for language-based practices, there's a risk of being reduced to the role of explanation or explication, which gives the practice both undue authority or power over, and at the same time impoverishes or disempowers it, strips it of its creative capacity as a linguistic research practice. Yet artistic research writing isn't only theoretical writing. Rather than thinking of writing in such terms or even thinking of it as an obstacle, the issue at stake, as philosopher and media theorist Dieter Mersch suggests, is one of rising to the challenge of nevertheless finding the words to say the unsayable. He says, rather than talking about art, how might writing practice the more careful and gentle of which merely dares to touch? So not to shy away from language then, but to strive for the right kind of words. Or else, as Erin Manning says, swimming beyond the shallow end of language means composing with language's pre-articulations, its rhythms, its silences, its jumps in register, the dissolving, vanishing, falling apart of words, even as they are crafted. This is language in the making. It's what spurs us to read between the words. So when we're working with language, it can really help to have allies. And I'm going to touch on a couple of things, mindful of time, just to kind of expand a little bit of a sense of context, mainly through sort of pointing in different directions rather than talking about in detail. So some of the different critical contexts that I found nourishing and supportive. In their introduction to the creative critic, Emily Orley and Kasia Hilavara make a nod to Robin Nelson's notion of complementary writing to describe writings that work alongside practice, to gender scholar Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's critical practice of positioning oneself beside the art, or Eric Rogoff's notion of writing with. Parallel, Henk Borgdorf talks about a third way of writing about practice, one that does not interpret the artwork or reconstruct the artistic process, but involves an emulation of the non-conceptual contents embodied in art. Jane Rendell also talks about this sense of writing having the likeness of the practice. My own practice has come out, I suppose, really of an intersection of many different fields of practice that might include artistic research, but also conceptual art and its legacies, experimental literature, performance art, particularly in terms of score, scripts, notation, artist books, and typography. But it also has been informed by a number of other fields of practice. Significantly, I think performance writing, which is a term used to describe a shift of tendency emerging in the 1990s, with key protagonists being people like John Hall, Della Pollock's very important text performance writing. So I'm sort of pointing in the direction of context here, really. I mentioned Jane Randall. Jane's an architectural theorist, but has spent many years developing a notion of site writing to describe a kind of situatedness or site specificity of writing, a writing that sets up a particular relationship between space, place, and site, as well as through the subjectivity and the voice of the writer. More recently, as was mentioned in the introduction, I've been editing the journal on phenomenology and practice, focusing on the commonalities between phenomenological research practices and artistic research. And as part of this, I've really enjoyed reading some of the work of Max van Manen, and in particular how within phenomenology, there's also a commitment to try and find ways of writing in fidelity to this lived experience and the embodied dimension of lived experience. Huge list, which I'm not going to talk about, but certainly just to highlight all of the different potentialities of writing as practice. Rolf Hughes, in his chapter in the exposition of artistic research, generates this gigantic list of possibilities of writing, each of which has its own context, each of which has its own lineage and genealogy. And then what I wanted to end on really was to sort of say that one of the things I've been doing in recent years is also not just looking towards existing contexts, but trying to make a shared context. In 2019, within the frame of the Research Pavilion in Venice, I co-hosted an event called Convocation on expanded language-based practices. And out from this, with Cordula Daus, Lena Serafin, and Alexander Damianish, we founded the Society of Artistic Research Special Interest Group for Language-Based Artistic Practices. And in a sense, we're not really interested in defining it, but really looking at what the possibilities might be. How is artistic research undertaken in and through different language-based practices? So yeah, we're really interested in exploring language as part of artistic research rather than as a tool of explanation or explication. We're interested in trying to move beyond language within academia only functioning in conventional terms to think about other kinds of performative modes of publication, and really trying to create a context for researchers to come together to generate a sense of solidarity and community. So in these last years, we've been hosting a number of events, exploring different urgencies and affinities within this field, as well as publishing platforms called practice sharing online. So online, we have 2 practice sharings, which present around about 150 different examples of practice-based or kind of language-based artistic research through a whole international community of different practitioners. So we've also got a call out, and I was going to end on this. We've just made a call. We've got an event coming up in Vienna. It's the second convocation of gathering of language-based practices, where we want to really focus on the sharing of practices to ask how can we share artistic research practices in language, what new formats and models might be required, and what happens when we bring them into dialogue. So really, if you or any of subsequent listeners are interested, join the mailing list for the special interest group. The research catalogue exposition is on the research catalogue and can be easily found. Do join the mailing list, and receive more information about this network.